In this video, we're going to talk about a flow control statement called a switch statement. It's similar to an if-else statement where you can make certain decisions based on the user's input. However, with a switch statement, it's more closely related to if you want to make a very specific selection. So let's get started. I already created the design or the layout for our application. It's just going to be a vending machine. So we have some drinks available, and we can select a letter option, click purchase, and based on which purchase we make, we will get a drink. And in these blank labels will be a number representing the quantity of drinks that are remaining. So let's get started. This is going to be a somewhat complex-ish program. It's going to be more complex than most of the previous tutorials, but I want to cover previous concepts just to help, reaffirm them or to solidify them in your brain. So I already initialized the purchase button, so let's take a look at that. Here we are. So the purchase button, we're going to start with our switch statement. And what a switch statement does, at its basic, is it takes some kind of data input from the user. In this case, the data input is going to be our text box. I named the text box txt selection, so let's go here. Txt selection dot text, and our switch statement is going to validate for strings, so we don't need to convert this from a string into a decimal or a double or whatever. We just need to keep it as a string. And of course, in a switch statement, you don't need to use strings. You can use whatever you want, but in this example, we'll be using strings. So you want to define each potential outcome from your switch statement. So these outcomes will be called cases. So case, and if we enter the letter A, then something's going to happen. So I believe selection A was for Coke, right? Yeah, Coke. So if we select Coke, then we're going to just get a message box output and say that you have purchased Coke. And then one more thing that you need to include in every case, this is really important. You need to include something called a break statement. And what a break statement does is it exits the entire switch statement. So if we have like 20 different cases A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, etc., etc., the break statement will allow us to exit the switch statement immediately. If you don't include the break statement, then your program will not compile. You won't be able to run it. So anyway, so let's go ahead and I'll do the switch statements or the cases for the other 4 options off camera, and then I'll resume when I'm done. Alright, all done. We are back, and as you can see, for each case, letters A, B, C, D, and E, I've specified you got water, Sprite, Dr. Pepper, Pepsi. My personal favorite is Dr. Pepper, followed by Sprite. And I don't know if I prefer Coke or Pepsi. I really can't tell the difference, to be honest. I'm actually not a soda drinker. I drink a lot of water, but I would never buy water from a vending machine because you can get water for free at any restaurant. But anyhow, one thing I want to draw your attention to, though, is the default. Default plays the exact same role as an else does when you have an if-else, 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 if statement. So if none of these cases match, then you will, by default, go to whatever's in this statement right here. So if someone entered F into your switch statement, then it would go to default because F isn't an option here. So let's go and test this program. And I want to just mention really quickly that there is one additional thing we need to add before this is like complete as a program. But I want to show you what it looks like when the mistake is made, and then we'll fix it. And if you can guess the mistake already, then kudos to you. But let me show you the mistake. So let's go ahead and say Dr. Pepper, because I do like Dr. Pepper. Whenever I splurge on soda, I usually go Dr. Pepper. But yeah, there we go. And then we'll do water, because water is healthy. We're mostly made of water. We're like big water bags. And yeah. So let me show you what I was talking about regarding the thing that we need to fix, though. What if the person was like, you know what? We're going to put an A for Coke, and we'll just put an A, a lowercase a. Purchase. Invalid selection, please enter value A through E. So we put a lowercase a. And if you look closely in our program, we're only checking for an uppercase a, not a lowercase. Now, if we wanted to, we could do this, and that would work. But look at all this extra code we're having to write. So we have to do that for every single case, and that's a lot of work. And I'm lazy. You know, the best coders are lazy coders. So let's do something else. Instead of making lowercase versions of every case, what we're going to do is the text that gets entered into our text box, let's make it all capitalized. There is a method that's built into the .NET framework that allows you to make something uppercase. Now, keep in mind, in the past when we've done something like this, we've just put like a word and that's it. Like if we do .text or .checked, that's because when we're doing .text or .checked, we are referring to properties that are in this properties pane down here, like so. But in this example, we want to include a pair of parentheses. And that action, that indicates that some event or some action is going to be taken. So if we don't include parentheses, then it would be something where you return a property or an adjective, where you return some information that describes the object that you're appending the property to. But toUpper is not a property, it's a method. It's an action. It's the action of making whatever this is, making it uppercase. So we're going to put parentheses back, and we're going to rerun the program. And we will see that even if we put a lowercase letter in, it'll still come out as a valid response. So let's say lowercase a, purchase, and we have purchased a Coke. Awesome. Lowercase e, we have purchased the water. I don't think we've gotten the Sprite yet, so let's do D. And there we go, Sprite. One more thing regarding the switch statement that I want to bring your attention to. So pay attention that what we have here, the information we got from the text box, it's in a string format. And that happens to be what we're looking for. We want to look for something in the string format. But note that when we evaluate it, like let's say for example, like when we have each case statement, we need to make sure that the item that we're validating against, like A, B, C, D, and E, we need to make sure that they're also in a string format. And for that reason, you need to make sure that they're all inside their own quotation mark, because that's what indicates them as a string. Now, if on the other hand, we decide that instead of looking for a string value, that we want to look for a numeric value, like a decimal or a double or an integer or something like that. Well, you can do that as well. So I'm going to get rid of this toUpper thing, just temporarily. And I'm going to do my convert to decimal. And what we'll do here is since quotations indicate strings, that means we need to get rid of the quotations. And we also need to replace the letters with actual numeric values. So instead of A, B, C, D, E, I'll just do 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And this would work too. So instead of doing A, B, C, D, E, we could run a program and select 1, which is Coke, or 2, which is Pepsi. And you get the idea. But in this example here, I was just showing you that to show you that you can use numeric values as well. But in this example, we want to stick with our string value because that's the key that we have in the display right here. We have A, B, C, D, and E instead of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Just personal preference. So at this point, we are done with all the information that I want to present about switch statements. If the only purpose for viewing this video is to learn about switch statements, then you may want to stop watching now, because everything else is going to be just some like extra add-on stuff to make this entire program more functional. So just a heads up, but if you want to learn more, then keep watching, because we're going to do a lot of feature adding to this program. Okay, if you're still here, then let's get started. So what I want to do is make use of these 5 labels. They're blank. What I want to do is populate these labels with values that equal how much Coke, Pepsi, Dr. Pepper, Sprite, and water we have in stock in the vending machine. So how do we do that? Well, what we could do, this is not what we're going to eventually do, but what we could do is we could just go to the text property for each label and assign default values to it. But later on, when we make a purchase, we're going to want to decrease the number by -1 every time we make a purchase. And if we populate based on the text property alone, that's going to make the subtraction process much more difficult. So this is not the best way to go about doing this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create 5 global variables and initialize them to whatever value I want to make the vending machine stock capacity. So I'm going to do, actually no, I'm going to do integer, because we only need integer. We're never going to have half of a drink in the vending machine. We're going to have an even number of drinks. So integer, and I'll say num Coke, num Pepsi, num Dr. Pepper, num Sprite, and num water. For some reason I thought I misspelled num Sprite, but I don't think I did. And we'll go ahead and initialize each of these variables at certain numbers. So how much Coke should we start with in stock? Let's say we have 5 Coke. And Pepsi, I'll just say we have 5 as well. I don't want to give preference, because I know there are some people who have a strong preference for Coke or Pepsi, and I don't want to infer that one is more popular than the other, right? Dr. Pepper, I prefer Dr. Pepper, but it's usually not as frequently purchased, so we're going to say that not as many people have bought any Dr. Pepper, so we'll say it's about 7. And then Sprite, we'll say that there are 6 available. And water, people don't want to buy water because the water, let's say, is the exact same cost as Coke or Dr. Pepper or Pepsi, and people would rather have the flavored soda than water. So let's say we have 8 waters available right now. So those are our initial values. Now what we need to do, this is a new topic which unless you already know C#, this is something that you haven't seen before. It's a method that gets called, or it's an event method, I should say, that gets called when your form first loads. So we have our regular event method that happens when we click our button, but we'll also now have an event method that occurs as soon as this form right here becomes visible or gets activated when we run the program. So to create this event method, you initialize it the same way you would initialize the purchase button. You double click on it, but you need to make sure that when you double click, the area that you double click on doesn't have a button or a text box or any labels on it. It needs to be an empty place of the form. So it could be along the edge, it could be up here between, it could be down this edge, but anywhere that has just a blank form. So I'm going to double click, and right there is our form event method. So it occurs, or it activates when the form gets loaded. And when the form gets loaded, we want to automatically populate each of these labels with the corresponding quantity. So let's go ahead and do that. We have LBL Coke dot text equals numcoke. We also have, I'll do the rest of them. I'll do the rest of them on my own and resume the video as soon as I'm done with that, so you don't have to watch me make all of these, so hold on. Alright, I'm back, and here's our series of assignments. So keep in mind the LBL Coke, LBL Pepsi, LBL Dr. Pepper, etc. correspond to these label names right here. So let's go ahead and start our application and see what it looks like. As you can see, we got pre-populated values. Pretty cool, huh? Okay. So let's go back to our code and add a little bit more functionality. So when we go ahead and when we run our program and click the purchase button, when we purchase a specific beverage, we need to reduce the amount of beverages we have in stock by the appropriate number. So when we have Coke, when we have a purchase of Coke, we'll need to go ahead and reduce the numCoke global variable by 1. So let's do that. Simple decrement operator like that. And then we'll do the exact same thing for Pepsi and Dr. Pepper. Sprite and water. Pretty simple, right? Now keep in mind that all these statements do, these 5 statements right here, all they do is change the global variables. That's it. It doesn't do anything to the actual output displayed in the labels, which is annoying. Our values or our stock level has decreased, but it isn't getting output to show that the stock level has decreased. So what we'll have to do is we're going to have to rerun these lines of code to repopulate the labels with the new values, with the new global values. Let me show you right now what it looks like when it's incorrect, just so you can better see the serious error that's going on. So we got, let's say we bought some Dr. Pepper, click purchase. We bought Dr. Pepper, but still says 7. So we need to rerun the little script that outputs the global variables into these labels right here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually modularize my code by making a custom function to do this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new function, private void display new stock. amounts. And I'm going to put all that stuff in there. So now, when we want to update our labels to match our global variables, all we have to do is call this method instead. So I'm going to take this method and put it into our form loading method, our form loading event method, and there we go. And now I'll just copy and paste this method name into each and every one of our cases. Okay, so what do we have now? Let's take a look at our current program. We're not done yet, even though you may think we are, but we are most certainly not done yet. Alright, so let's go ahead and buy a Pepsi. Click purchase. You have purchased a Pepsi, and the quantity is updated to 4. Let's buy another Pepsi. Let's do purchase again. We'll buy a third Pepsi, and then a fourth Pepsi, and then a fifth Pepsi, and we're out of stock. Let's try to buy another Pepsi. Hey, we can still buy Pepsis, and now we have negative stock. That's obviously a problem. So now we need to include some logic that prevents us from making a purchase if our beverages are out of stock. So how do we do that? Well, we'll need to create an if-else statement to validate whether or not quantity is at 0. So what we could do, if we want, would be to create an if-else statement in each one of these cases. So let's see what that would look like. So if numCoke, let's say if it is less than or equal to 0, which means if it is out of stock, then we'll get the result that says we are out of stock of this beverage. Simple. And then, of course, the else statement would be this bit of code right here. And pay close attention that we did not include the break statement in either the if or the else. And the reason why is because we want the break to occur no matter what. So if we are out of stock, or if we aren't out of stock, we still want the break statement to take us out of this case, or out of the switch statement. Now, of course, the annoying fact is that we'll have to do this exact same process for each of the 5 cases. So let me show you a way to use methods so that you don't have to do this for every case, so that you can keep your your code nice and compact and simple. I'm going to go ahead and undo this tab right here to make it look better. By the way, the like the tabbing, going 1 tab versus 2 tabs versus 3 tabs or whatever, this has no real impact on how your code works. The only reason why I tab like that or indent like that is to make the code easier to read. That's literally the only reason why I do it. So let's go ahead and create our method. So let's say that our method is private, and it will return a Boolean value, like a true or false, and we'll call it check in stock. And it will get a value passed into it. It's going to be a an integer. So I'll just do int, and I'll call it x. Again, it really doesn't matter what value you put in here. All that matters is that it's some unique variable, so I'm just using x. And what we're going to do here is we're going to have our if-else statement inside. And we're going to say if x is less than or equal to 0, then we're going to return 0. Or rather, I should say false. That's a bit more accurate. However, you can also return true. So what do we do here? So again, like I said, we're going to return false if we are out of stock, if we have 0 sodas in stock or fewer, which we shouldn't have less than 0, but yeah. But that's how it works. And then of course if we have greater than 0 sodas or beverages in stock, then we'll return true. Now this is something we haven't really seen before. This is when you actually can have multiple return statements in a method. We did not talk about this when we originally went over methods earlier, but this is something that I want to introduce to you now because this is it's a situation that is applicable to what we're doing right now. So again, depending on which of these two options gets selected or gets executed, you'll either return false or you'll return true. Now, let me quickly show you something that sometimes confuses people or sometimes gives people a hard time. If we do if we do an else if statement and say x is greater than 0, then we'll be like, oh yeah, so if it's less than or equal to 0, we return false. But if it's greater than 0, we return true, right? So why are you getting this error message up here? So whenever you have a return type that is not void, whenever we have like a bool or double or decimal or string or whatever return type, that means that every single possible outcome of the function, or rather, in this code, every single possible outcome must have a potential return statement. So what this means, in this particular situation, that requirement has not been met. And the reason why is because option 1, perhaps we have less than or equal to 0. If that's the case, we'll return false. Option 2, it's going to be greater than 0. And if that's the case, then we'll return true. Now, when we think about this as humans, we can logically think, or we can logically realize that these are the only two possible options, period, end of story. But the compiler in Visual Studio, it's not smart like a human. It doesn't know this or doesn't realize that these are the only two possible options. From the standpoint of the compiler, this if-else-if statement, it leaves, I guess, an empty, dangling possibility. Whenever you have an if-else-if statement, you always, if you're going to be returning values from inside the statements, you always need to also include a dangling else statement and include a return statement inside that as well. Because if you don't have that last default scenario, then it just won't work. The compiler thinks that there's still a possibility that you won't have a valid return statement. So if that's the case, then make sure that you put that extra else statement in there, or better yet, just get rid of the condition and the if statement right here. And that'll work too. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is we need to call this check-in-stock method. So I'm going to go ahead and call the method right here. and I'm going to pass in num Coke. Now you may be wondering, why are we passing in a global variable, right? Because a global variable can be accessed by any method, including check and stock. Well, the purpose of check and stock is to be able to be reused for any of the 5 beverages. If we relied on using the global variable as a regular global variable, then we would need to specify for each instance. We would need to do 5 separate if-else statements, one of them for each of the flavors or each of the beverage types. So we would need to do an if-else for Coke, one for Pepsi, one for Dr. Pepper, one for Sprite, and one for water. And I mean, we could do that, but again, it would be a lot of extra space. So we don't want to do that, and it would get a lot more complicated than what we're doing right now. So I strongly recommend not doing it that way. So in this method, we're basically taking a global variable and we're passing it by value into our small method. And depending on which variable we pass in, it'll determine which beverage we check stock levels for. So this method right here will return either true or false. So we'll say that if this line of code equals true, then we'll do all of that. But if it's false, then we do our out of stock message. And technically, you don't need this equals true thing. This actually means the exact same thing as equals true. And if you're wondering how to do equals false, the way to do that would be to put an exclamation mark in front right there. So kind of interesting. Now, unfortunately, while we did automate some of this process in our method up here, it didn't do a whole lot to condense the amount of code we wrote. So I'm going to do something else to make this, I would say, dramatically reduce the amount of code that we have to write in our program. So I'm actually going to restructure this a bit. I wanted to go through this process to show you how to return multiple values if you wanted to. And there's nothing wrong with that. When you return multiple values, you'll only return one value, and the first value that gets returned will end the method. But I want to show you, in my opinion, a better way to do this. One that's much more efficient, much cleaner, and more space saving with how much code you have to write. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to transfer all of this into a method, into this method right here. So I'm going to actually change the name of the method right here and say process transaction, because it's not going to just check for the stock levels, but it's also going to perform the transaction if it can be performed. And I'm going to add a second variable to pass in. It's going to be a string, and I'm going to call it, actually no, I'm going to call it beverage. So what we're going to do is I'm going to get rid of this bit, and this, and all of this gunk. Get rid of all of that. And I'm going to go ahead, cut, and paste up into here. Next, what I'm going to do is, again, remember, this is what happens when we have stock available, and this is what happens when we do not have stock available. So what we're going to do is, if stock is not available, Then we're going to output a message and say, sorry, we are out of stock of, and then I'll use the concatenate operator, which is a plus sign, and I'll concatenate this beverage variable next to it. So what is this beverage variable supposed to be? So in our switch statement down here, we're going to pass two variables. What was the method name? Process transaction. And we're going to pass an integer and a string. So just like before, we have num Coke as our first variable that we're passing, but we're also going to pass the name of the beverage, Coke. And then we could use Coke as our beverage name up here and insert that beverage name into our output messages to the customer. So sorry, we are out of stock of Coke. Or if we do it down here for Pepsi, we'll instead pass Pepsi into the method. Or Dr. Pepper, or Sprite, or whatever you want. And the same thing goes for right here. With the message that confirms what we purchased, we'll go ahead and also use the beverage variable to indicate which beverage is being purchased. And pay close attention to the fact that I included a blank space right here, because in a regular sentence cadence, you would have, each word separated by a space. You'll want a space between the last word before the variable, like soda, like Coke or whatever, between the last word and the actual beverage variable. And then, of course, back here I just put an exclamation mark because that's what the original celebratory "you purchased soda" message had, an exclamation mark. So all we're doing is just using this plus sign to squish these strings together. We're going to concatenate this string with this variable value with this second string right here. Same thing up here, we're concatenating or squishing together this string with whatever's in this variable right there. Alright, one more thing we need to change, and I'm actually going to do this incorrectly just to show you what it looks like, is you need to update the variable name of the Coke or the soda that's being decreased by 1. Change it to match the variable being passed in. And again, this is actually not going to work. I want to show you what it looks like when it doesn't work, and then I'll fix it later on to show you how to make it work properly. So at this point, we are passing in, again, two variables. We're passing in the name of the variable we need to change to decrease if we're buying soda. And we need to pass in the actual name of the beverage to output in our either out of stock message or the "you have purchased a beverage" message. So at this point we can go back down to our switch statement and check out our code. And go ahead and just copy the method call to each one, to each case. And this is where the simplification occurs, where you don't have to put gobs of code in every case. You just have a single method call, and all the complicated code will be in the method call. So I'm just going to go ahead and update. In fact, I'll probably pause the video while I update and then show you when I'm done. Alright, I'm all done. And as you can see, now we're passing in the specific variable values for each soda and the actual names of the sodas. Oh, forgot to capitalize pepper. There we go. And also, since all the action, like all the transaction requirements, all the stock checking, the updating, all that stuff, since this is all taken care of inside this method, we don't actually need to return any values to our original call right here. So what I'm going to do is just go ahead and delete the return statements and change the return type to void because we're no longer returning anything. Okay, so let's go ahead and see our program, which will not work, and I will show you exactly why it doesn't work. It actually should be pretty obvious to you. Okay, so let's buy a Coke with the letter A. Purchase. But look, Coke hasn't been decreased. Why is that? How about Pepsi? Let's try that. Oh, the stock didn't go down. Let's try Dr. Pepper. No? How about Sprite? No, not really? Really? Oh, man. And water? Nothing. So what's going on here? Well, it's one of two things. Either the display stock amounts method somehow isn't working properly, or this method or this statement right here isn't working properly. Now, if you have any ideas, just if you want to think about it for a second, do. But I'll give you the answer right now. So the stock amounts, nothing has changed in this method. It's just a simple method call with no parameter sending, no return value. Nothing has changed about this method, so it's very unlikely to be that. The problem here is actually the x value. So in this method down here, when we pass the global variable numCoke, when we pass that variable into this method right here, what ends up happening is we're copying the value of numCoke. So we're copying the value of however much we currently have in stock of Coke, passing it into the method, and basically taking that copied value and assigning it to x. X, which by the way, is now a local variable inside just this method. And that's what we're referring to here. When we do x minus minus, is all we're doing is decreasing the local variable x, which was given a value to it by the global variable numCoke, or numPepsi, or whatever. So what we need is this particular variable here, we need it to still reference the global variable. And we can do that by adding the ref keyword to pass by reference. And then we need to update all of the function calls down here. So ref, all 5 of them. And now the function, or now the program will work properly. Let's take a look. Alright, so again, we'll do A for Coke. We have bought a Coke, and it goes down by 1. Let's do another Coke, and another, and another. And now we're out of stock. So let's see if we get an error message. Sorry, we are out of stock. Let's see if it stays at 0 when we click OK. And it does, it stays at 0. Let's try some Pepsi. We've bought Pepsi. We've bought more Pepsi. Again, and again, and again, and we're out of stock. So, at this point, that's the entirety of this vending machine application that I want to show you. I want to, obviously I want to show you what a switch statement is like, how you can use it. It's really, really, really useful. I want to go into greater depth, give you a more complicated example of how to create methods, specifically a method that lets you reuse it multiple times for different purposes, or for different examples like this, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I want to briefly introduce you to the concept of having multiple return statements in a single method. Remember earlier we had return false in here and return true in here. That's important to understand how to do that, although in this particular program I didn't want that structure to be used for the final application. And I also showed you another example of how to more effectively modularize your code so that you create one method that does everything you need, based on values that get passed in. And I also want to show you an example that I hope will better illustrate to you the difference between passing by value and passing by reference. So that's it. Hopefully this video has been useful to you, and I will see you in the next video. Have a good day.